Hey guys, welcome back to part 10 of Peter Walker's From Surviving to Thriving. We're continuing on with chapter 3, Parentectomy and Relational Healing. Prepare to be triggered. We're talking about parents here, and not the good ones. I have worked with many clients who began therapy with me while they were still over-controlled by their traumatizing parents, both externally as well as internally. Sometimes the control was enforced by as little as one phone call a week. You can relate if you've had toxic parents that strung you along even into adulthood. I was codependent, and I was always also trying to fight against the feelings that I felt that were hidden towards my mother, and sometimes not so hidden. But I never truly understood the depth of anguish that I felt towards her, and sometimes, if not often, hatred as I grew up, because she hadn't protected me, is what it ultimately comes down to. She had enabled the abuse, the sexual abuse by my brother. It was a very small house, and she was a very smart woman. And the fact is that there I found myself at age 35, newly married woman, adult of all adults, right? Supposedly. And yet I was still getting that come over once a week so you can help with chores around here. Around here being the house where I was abused. And what was the main topic at almost all start of conversations, or somewhere in the conversations that they would have with me upon those 1 week visits, was of course my brother this and my brother that. And I remember one instance where I was over there cleaning, and my brother had sent my mother and my grandmother, they lived together in that house of abuse. I don't know why I laughed at that. Because it was a cute, perfectly maintained little house with completely sensible looking, middle-aged and saintly grandmother, and my mom, nurse that worked 40 hours a week and would come home to this house and her massive library. That was my mother's thing. Some women have clothes or things. My mother was books. So in this perfect, picturesque little tiny house, all this mayhem had occurred. And there I was at 35, still going over there once a week to take their shit. And I felt all these feelings. This need to be loved by my mother, accepted by my grandmother. They were never ever fulfilled. And yet I was there play acting in their fictional world where they were still praising my brother every chance they could. And when I win no contact with my mother, and still would, in my heart of hearts, desperately desire to have her attempt to contact me, which never happened. Who she ended up contacting was the most important person in my life, which was my nephew. The other normal Gardea, as we called ourselves. Gardea being my last name and my nephew's last name. But she contacted him and contacted my brother to bitch about how I wasn't going over there to help them anymore. What a bad daughter I was. I had full-on conversations, both on the telephone and in person, begging them to come to therapy. This is a generational curse, this sexual abuse. We must heal this. I forgive you guys, da 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 da. Put myself on the line a bunch of times. To an annoyed face, a dismissive attitude, and an annoyed expression of complete dismissal of anything that I was expressing to them in regards to being raped for 14 years by my brother. So when I read this earlier, sometimes the control was enforced by as little as one phone call a week. Is that a narcissistic thing? I wouldn't, throughout my young childhood into adulthood, teenagehood into adulthood, when I moved out, I was 17, got out as fast as I could, 2 weeks before my 18th birthday, and I would, I guess, not call, and she would eventually, within a week, get a hold of me to guilt trip me about it. This woman, my mother, once I had broken out of that house after such a horrible childhood, when I was barely 18 and broke out of there, she ended up having to be forced by her work to go to therapy because she was having anger bursts at work. She was a nurse at a convalescent hospital. And part of her therapy was that she had to come and apologize to me. I think that was the only time my mother, in regards to the abuse, was able to be at the threshold of authenticity, of actually speaking the truth. I remember she cried. We shared a cigarette in my house, inside, because she always smoked outside. Inside my apartment at 18 years old, she came to apologize because when I left and she had no black sheep to beat on, she turned it on at work. And it was putting her livelihood at risk. And that's the only time I remember her even remotely admitting that she had done wrong. I was so awestruck by the "I'm sorry," which I had never heard in my entire time of being her daughter, that I immediately broke down and hugged her. I think so much of my life is lost in the vaults of my memory bank, where everything got shuffled around on purpose by my mind so that I wouldn't have to keep reliving the abuse. And so when I read this book and have conversations like the one I'm having with you here, y'all out there that can relate, it's hard. It's hard to look back and go, that was my mom, that was my grandmother. How did they not do a better job? And what did it cost me? Was this all divinely planned? Because they say that divine is in one idea. Anything that happened to you had a purpose, was absolutely in alignment to what needed to happen in order for this life to unfold in just the right way. In some ways, that's infuriating, and in other ways, if you think about it as a witness and not personally, if you just view it from above, there's a lot of relief there. There was a purpose for this. Let's keep tracking authentically forward and find out what that purpose is. And that's the type of thoughts I have to get out of the horror and the grief and just desperate confusion that comes from thinking of my childhood and when it comes to my toxic parent. Because there was nothing I could do then, and now it's up to me to be released from that misery by choosing to take it in, work through this with you guys, and see how it comes out at the other end. We're only at the beginning of chapter 3 here, middle of chapter 3. That's my intent, to break through, to feel the feelings but not get engulfed by them, to hopefully have this be relatable to others so that they don't feel crazy, so that they don't feel hatred, so that they don't feel abandoned, so that they don't feel grief that's never ending. Not infrequently, going back to the book, these clients were also being overpowered and or abandoned in relationships as abusive and neglectful as the one they had with their parents. This is repetition compulsion at its most destructive, and it strands survivors in experiencing the worst of both worlds. Though in-depth exploration of their childhood trauma, many of my still trapped clients achieved psychological freedom from their parents for the first time in their lives. Once again, this was a freedom that they had not actually achieved, even though they had been living on their own for decades. The reason I have to do this is, as you may remember from the intro if you watched that, is I've been in no contact with my mother since 3-4 years now. I don't even want to think back to that time. Let's say 4 years. Jesus. And until feels like it's all still right there, and I wasn't looking at it. I was deadpan to it. I would say, oh, I forgive them, God be with them, and on and forward I go. But my friend Electrum, who is quite the hidden shaman, she doesn't advertise it, she's a true shaman, informed me that my mother wound was very much still there, and that I still hated her, and that I needed to work through it. And the wall that has been built against all of that is massive. Because when I cracked open the reality of my mother is a narcissist, my grandmother's a covert narcissist, my brother is a sociopath, God damn it, how did I get in this family? Why did I choose this family according to some way of thinking? People say, oh, you chose your parents, you chose this experience to advance your soul, your higher self. Well, that's a lot of words, and that's a lot of possibilities of thought. But when it comes to the reality of experiencing the childhood that I did with the parents that I did, it still doesn't make any damn sense. And that's what I'm here to work through. Because much as this says, I'm going to be 42 soon. And none of that reality that I experienced, from what I remember, is really gone anywhere. Still sitting there holding space. And I don't want it to affect my future anymore. I don't want another decade of this hovering over me. My grandmother turned 90 years old recently. And she's still sitting at the same dining room table with my mother in the same dining area in the same chairs, where I used to have to sit at every day at dinner in the corner. They sat me in the corner between my brother and my mother, so that I had the edge of the table up against my stomach, while he'd be fucking with me underneath the table, pinching me, trying to grope me, while having another perfectly funny conversation with the rest of the people at the table. And what type of childhood did I have that I would sit through it? That I'd know better than to try to object and say, no, don't touch me. My mother would just tell me to shut up. Did you have parents like this? These clients gradually learn to live more successfully on their own without their parents' over-controlling, spoiling influence. Their ability to build self-nurturing relationships with themselves almost always correlated with a major reduction or complete severing of their relationships with their parents. So here's my advice. If you're still connected to a toxic, and understand what I mean by toxic. I know there's different levels of toxicity, and I know that everybody's feelings matter, and some people have troubling relationships with their parents, but the way to know the difference between the type of parent that you love enough because they love you enough to continue with the relationship and find their endearing parts and cling to that instead of being troubled by their annoying parts or whatever. I don't know what a normal fucking family is. I can presume that all families have issues, and the point is, if there's love there, if something happens to either you or them and both sides react immediately with concern, then you're probably in a good family. And this what I'm going to advise is not for you. But for those of us that know that our parents would most likely show up to shame you, or if not at that moment, later at the first probable hurtful time, they'll definitely bring up whatever this thing that occurred where you almost got hurt. Oh, it'll be your fault, and they will get you into shame over it. If you have those type of parents, just get out. Is it going to be hard? It's going to be so fucking hard. You're going to be staring at that phone or going to that mailbox or checking your whatever text, however way of communication that you're thinking that they will find to somehow give a fuck because they're your parent. No, they won't. And that's going to be the hard part. But it's gonna make you break free, which is where I broke free, and I thought I was free. I broke free after so much pain when I realized she is never gonna contact me. It's one of the only reasons I'm still on fucking Facebook. And I post shit up there, and I'm just like, does my mom sit there in the middle of the night and click my name in and check how I'm doing? I'm delusional if I think that's what she does. In parts of me, that's why I'm posting stuff that I'm doing. Maybe mommy will care. So I got through the part of breaking out. And I've put space and in time and distance, physical distance from them. And I have now been able to catch my breath because I found my own home after my excursion out of California for the first time. I know I can rebuild a life elsewhere, and I think I found a place to call home. And so now, with that distance and space, having to come back in this moment like this right here and very authentically realize, good for you, Jeanette, you broke out. Good for you, you are able to breathe now. And good for you, you're able to not hurt now. And to drag myself back to this point because I recognize that I still haven't finished dealing with it, and that I'm going to have to, so it doesn't eat at me for the rest of my life, is a hard pill to swallow. But I don't think there's any other way. We have to look at this pain in our lives. So good on you for being here. If you've been led here, keep trucking through it. It's gonna suck, but it will lead to freedom. And hopefully we'll figure out how that works together with help like this. Okay, now I'm just gonna read because that was a lot. My head's starting to feel that overwhelmed thing that happens when my emotions are trying to shut down. Through the in-depth exploration of their childhood trauma, many of my still trapped clients achieve psychological freedom from their parents for the first time in their lives. Once again, this was a freedom that they had not actually achieved, even though they had been living on their own for decades. These clients gradually learned to live more successfully on their own without their parents' over-controlling, spoiling influence. Their ability to build self-nurturing relationships with themselves almost always correlated with a major reduction or complete severing of the relationship with their parent. My client, Joe, who was variously misdiagnosed as schizo, Asperger's, and paranoid, was living alone when he began therapy with me. He was extremely shut down and self-contained, but recognized himself as a freeze type from reading articles on my website. I'm a freeze type majority by far. Remember, there's fight, freeze, fawn. Sorry. That was a lot. Thank you. I hope that was... Thank you for listening to me for my little rant there. If you're still listening. This is why I have to do this. Getting him to talk at first was like pulling teeth, but over time I discovered that he was engaged in daily phone contact with his narcissistic, emasculating mother. Through our work and tremendous courage on his part, he gradually reduced the phone contact with his mother, at first to once a week, then once a month. My God, he must have gotten so much shit from his mother about that. Then only major holidays, and after a few years, almost never. See, the narcissistic parent just replaces you with something else. You're the only one trying to contact them. They don't give a fuck. When a parent is unrelentingly toxic, hearing even a few words from them can trigger the survivor into an intense emotional flashback, much like the one I'm trying to cover right now. I have worked with numerous clients who made very little progress in their recovery while they maintain contact with their toxic parent or parents. For this reason, such clients usually acquired a parentectomy to progress. There is a classic book by Bob Hoffman on this topic entitled Getting Divorced from Mother and Dad. As external freedom from mothering continued, Joe gradually achieved more and more internal freedom from her. During this time, he began to experience the first meaningful relating of his life in an ACP group. I don't know what ACP is. that for many years provided him with a great deal of positive companionship and relational healing. Joe finally concluded therapy with me then when a healthy primary relationship that he formed with a group member reached the 2-year mark. Learning to handle conflict in relationship is the next title. One caveat or warning for recovering the ability to authentically be yourself is that it is unreasonable and unfair to expect anyone to accept you if you are being abusively angry or contemptuous. Some trauma survivors flash back into this type of behavior by acting out from their outer critic. If this is an issue for you, apparently we're going to hear more about it in Chapter 10. Chapter 10 provides guidance for deconstructing this intimacy-destroying habit. In this vein, it is important to note that intimacy does not mean unconditional love. As John Gottman's scholarly research shows, a certain amount of disagreement, dissatisfaction, and disappointment is normal in relationship. And what does that mean for us that grew up all fucked up? When our family of origin in a toxic family, when it says that it's okay here in a normal, actual, healthy relationship to have these moments of disappointment, dissatisfaction, disagreement, none of those things were allowed us by far in toxic family structures. Disagreement? Fuck no. It's their way or the highway. Dissatisfaction? You could never criticize them. Never. Oh, God help you if you tried. Disappointment? They don't give a fuck. And fuck you for thinking that they should. So whenever these things appear in a normal relationship, we're going to overreact until we learn not to. Until we go, whoa, I just got triggered. I'm acting from my past. I'm time traveling right now. These are the things that I am and have been learning the last 5 years or so when it comes to dealing with any sort of relationship. And it's hard. It's hard not to react, overreact, or underreact in normal circumstances when these things were not allowed to be played out in your childhood. These normal things where people disagree or have dissatisfaction and disappointment in a normal day-to-day. So know that about people that come from fucked up childhoods. And talk about it. Be open about it. And teach new ways. If you're emotionally intelligent enough to do so, and they're open, teach them. That would have been very handy for me. The hallmark of successful couples is their ability to handle feelings of anger and hurt in a constructive and civil way. Amazing what that must be like, what that helps you achieve as a human being when you have that sort of normal relationship with your parents. The hallmark of successful couples is their ability to handle feelings of anger and hurt in a constructive and civil way. Gottman's studies have identified this as a key characteristic of couples who still really like each other after 10 years. Tools for lovingly resolving conflict, or toolbox 4 in chapter 16. So again, we have to wait for those. Is a pragmatic list of techniques and perspectives to help couples resolve disruptions in their mutual attunement. Well, that sounds all sorts of cool and grown up. We'll get to it. Moreover, books by the Gottmans and Sue Johnson provide a great deal of practical help. I also find that Beyond the Marriage Fantasy by Dan Beaver is especially helpful for men. The next chapter title is Reparenting within this chapter. I should say subchapter. Reparenting is a key aspect of relational healing. It is primarily a process of addressing the many developmentally arrested needs of the traumatized child that we were. In this book, we repeatedly address the two more fundamental of these needs: love and protection. They're like fucking unicorns. Even though my life is so much better now, the idea of love and protection as a whole actual experience that's consistent, it still seems like a fantasy, even though intellectually I know it's totally doable. Again, my childhood fucking me up now. Even with the knowledge that I now have and the self-love that I now possess, that trauma's still there. That's for someone else, not for me. Oh wait, it's supposed to be for me too. I can have that. I'm worthy of that. Of concepts that have never been sustained long enough to become normal. Yes. I just haven't experienced it for longer than like 8 months. I don't know why I just chose that random 8 months. I don't even know. One more little section here and we'll stop. Okay, suggested intentions for recovery. Toolbox 1 in Chapter 16 renders yet another picture of the diverse developmental arrests that may as of yet be unaddressed in the complex PTSD survivor. Yeah, I know. The toolbox presents these needs as tangible goals that we can use to direct our recovery efforts. Self-mothering and self-fathering. An important yin-yang dynamic of reparenting involves balancing self-mothering and self-fathering. When a child's mothering needs are adequately met, self-compassion is installed at the core of her being. When the same is true of her fathering needs, self-protection also becomes deeply embedded. Wow. Self-compassion is the domicile of recovery, and self-protection is its foundation. When self-compassion is sufficiently established as a home base, we return to in difficult times. An urge to be self-protective naturally arises from it. Living in the world without access to these primal instincts of survival is truly terrifying. Oh, that's what I was trying to explain a few minutes ago, like what it feels like when you don't actually know what that is as a reality. You are always on that edge. Even if you're not reactive as you were before, and just presume that everything was going to go to shit in a handbasket. Even if everything's quiet and still and there's that distance from the abuse and from the abusers, the reality is that you're most likely, like I'm realizing now, in the back of my head still waiting for abandonment or rejection or all those things to come up. Another 10 years of normalcy, maybe that feeling of being on that edge, even if it's not right on the edge anymore, will dissipate. And I won't be terrified anymore. I don't like to admit that I'm scared still by reading that sentence. living in the world without access to these primal instincts of survival is truly terrifying. That sentence is just so true. I can't deny it. We advance our recovery process immeasurably when we commit to remothering and refathering ourselves. That's how I got this far. I encourage you now to commit to becoming an unshakable source of compassion and protection for yourself. And I call that sovereignty. And I am in an active practice of that. That sovereignty, that self-parenting, that taking care of myself is what's got me to this point. It's why I got to age 40. I'm going to use this statistic once again. I'm sure I've used it before to close today's reading, confessional debriefing of why I'm here to recover from this, is that 40% of all long-term childhood sexual abuse survivors, 40% die through drug use or suicide or criminal activities, etc. by the age of 40. They don't make it. And I'm so relieved that I have, because it means I'm strong enough to continue with this type of shadow work. We'll get through it. And in 10 years, this will make a lot more sense. Because I will refuse not look at it. I refuse to not face it. Because I refuse for it to have any additional negative effect on my life than it already has. I hope you feel the same way. All right, guys. Good night for now.